Did he really predict the exact day of his death? That question has echoed through the annals of mathematics, history, and legend alike. Abraham de Moivre, the quiet refugee mathematician of the 18th century, is remembered as much for this chilling anecdote as for his extraordinary contributions to probability and complex numbers. A man who spent his life bent over parchment, ink staining his hands, numbers filling his mind, supposedly looked at the steady expansion of his sleep each night, 15 minutes more than the night before, and declared the date on which this pattern would reach 24 hours. On that day, he said he would not wake again. And, the story goes, he was correct. But how could such a claim be true? Was it a rational observation by a man who applied mathematics to every aspect of existence? Was it mere coincidence retold by admirers? Or was it an embellishment woven by later generations seeking to give poetic weight to the life of a scholar too often overshadowed by the giants around him, Newton, Halley, and the Bernoullis? To begin his story with this mystery is not to indulge in myth, but to reveal the way in which history remembers certain figures, not through their daily struggles or quiet triumphs, but through a single unforgettable tale. To understand the man behind this legend, we must step back more than 3 centuries to a time of religious wars, exiled communities, candlelit chambers filled with calculations, and a Europe trembling between the remnants of the medieval world and the dawn of the Enlightenment. Abraham de Moivre lived at the intersection of faith and reason, exile and belonging, obscurity and brilliance. His work would lay the foundation for probability theory, actuarial science, and even the bell curve that shapes modern statistics. Yet he himself lived in poverty, surviving as a tutor, never securing the professorship or fame that might have secured him comfort. The story of de Moivre is not just about mathematics, it is about perseverance in exile, about the quiet dignity of intellectual labor, and about the strange ways in which genius is recognized, ignored, or distorted by history. And it is also about the human tendency to find in numbers not only rationality, but destiny. The anecdote of de Moivre's death appears in multiple 18th century accounts. According to one version, he noticed in his old age that he was sleeping 15 minutes longer each night. He calculated the progression and realized that eventually he would reach a full 24 hours of continuous sleep. He marked that date, the 27th of November, 1754, and on that very day he died. To modern ears, this sounds both absurd and strangely poetic. Could a man's body obey such an arithmetical sequence? Was it not more likely that, weakened by age, he simply declined, and the tale was embroidered afterward? Historians often caution against reading such anecdotes literally. Yet, whether true or false, the story captures something essential about de Moivre. His life was so deeply intertwined with numbers that even his death was remembered in numerical terms. This legend also symbolizes his marginal status. Unlike Newton, whose name was tied to the laws of motion and gravitation, or Leibniz, remembered for calculus and philosophy, de Moivre's name circulated most famously with a personal anecdote, a curiosity passed along by later generations. His mathematical achievements were immense, but they required careful excavation by historians to be fully appreciated. For the lay public, the myth of his self-predicted death was easier to remember, but to stop there would do him injustice. His life story of exile from France, of refuge in England, of friendship with some of the greatest scientific minds of his time, and of intellectual breakthroughs that laid the foundations of probability deserves to be told in depth, not as a footnote to Newton, not as a quaint anecdote, but as the chronicle of a mind that helped change the world. To understand where de Moivre came from, we must first understand the France of his birth. Abraham was born on the 26th of May, 1667, in Vitry-le-François, a small town in the Champagne region. France at this time was under the rule of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, whose reign embodied both magnificence and oppression. Vitry-le-François was no Paris, but it was a place of industrious families and religious diversity, at least for a time. Abraham's family were Huguenots, French Protestants, who traced their faith back to the teachings of John Calvin. For decades, the Huguenots had been granted limited toleration under the Edict of Nantes, 1598. But tensions simmered, and by the time of Abraham's youth, hostility toward Protestants was rising again. As a boy, Abraham was educated in both religious and classical studies. Mathematics soon caught his attention. He is said to have studied Euclid's Elements at a young age, fascinated by the clarity of geometry compared to the uncertainty of politics and theology. The rational order of lines, angles, and circles appealed to a mind seeking stability in a turbulent world. Yet his future would not be secure in France. In 1685, when he was just 18, Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes through the Edict of Fontainebleau. Overnight, Protestant churches were destroyed, Protestant schools closed, and hundreds of thousands of Huguenots faced persecution. Many fled France, an exodus of talent that would strengthen other European nations while weakening France itself. Among them was Abraham de Moivre. Abraham fled France, leaving behind homeland, security, and many family ties. He joined the wave of Huguenot refugees who scattered across Europe, from the Netherlands to Prussia to England. These refugees often carried skills, knowledge, and resilience that enriched their adopted countries. England, under King Charles II and later William III, became one of the centers of Huguenot settlement. London welcomed weavers, artisans, merchants, and intellectuals who arrived from across the Channel. Abraham, with his mathematical talents, found himself in this new world of opportunity and struggle. Life for a refugee was never easy. De Moivre lacked wealth and connections. To survive, he offered tutoring in mathematics, working with students who needed instruction in geometry, algebra, and eventually probability. Tutoring was his livelihood for most of his life. Unlike Newton, who held a chair at Cambridge, or Halley, who became Astronomer Royal, de Moivre never secured a permanent position in the academy. Yet exile also brought him into contact with England's vibrant scientific community. London was the home of the Royal Society, founded in 1660, which gathered the leading scientific thinkers of the age. Figures like Edmund Halley, Isaac Newton, and Robert Hooke were shaping the new science. It was here that de Moivre would eventually carve out a place for himself, not as a celebrated leader, but as a respected colleague and sometimes collaborator. For de Moivre, mathematics was not only an intellectual passion, but also a means of survival. His tutoring was steady but modest. He taught the sons of merchants and gentlemen, guiding them through Euclidean geometry and algebraic puzzles. He also advised gamblers and speculators who sought his insights into odds and chances. Gambling was widespread in 18th century England, and his calculations found eager clients in taverns and salons. This dual role teacher to students and consultant to gamblers illustrates how mathematics, in his hands, was both lofty and practical. He could navigate the abstractions of complex numbers while also calculating the odds of drawing a winning card. This blend of theory and practice would define much of his later work. But beyond survival, mathematics gave de Moivre a sense of purpose. He was not a soldier, a statesman, or a wealthy merchant. He was, instead, a man of numbers, a thinker who could bring clarity to chance, predictability to uncertainty, and structure to chaos. His life was a testament to the power of intellect, even in the face of exile and poverty. By the end of the 17th century, de Moivre had begun to attract notice. His skills brought him into contact with Edmund Halley, who was fascinated by probability and mortality tables, and with Isaac Newton, whose Principia Mathematica, 1687, had redefined physics and mathematics. Newton reportedly admired de Moivre's intellect. In one anecdote, Newton, when too tired to explain his own work, would say, "Go to de Moivre. He knows all this better than I do." Whether literally true or not, this remark reflects the respect de Moivre commanded among his peers. Gradually, his reputation grew. In 1697, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. This recognition, though significant, did not alter his financial situation. Still, it gave him a platform and connections that would allow his ideas to circulate more widely. Among his earliest published works was his study of probability, which would culminate in his famous book, The Doctrine of Chances. But even before that, he was laying the foundations for what would become his most enduring mathematical contribution, the formula that now bears his name. Abraham de Moivre entered the world on the 26th of May, 1667, in the modest town of Vitry-le-François, nestled in the Champagne region of northeastern France. This was a land of vineyards, churches, cobblestone streets, and markets bustling with trade. Though small compared to Paris, Vitry was a place where local families lived tightly woven lives shaped by commerce, faith, and tradition. The de Moivre family belonged to the Huguenot minority Protestants in a Catholic kingdom. Their faith already marked them as outsiders in a society ruled by Louis XIV, the self-styled Sun King, who envisioned religious uniformity as essential to the glory of France. In Abraham's early years, however, the Edict of Nantes, 1598, still offered limited protection to Huguenots. They could worship, educate their children, and participate in civic life, albeit under constant scrutiny. In such a household, young Abraham grew up in an atmosphere of discipline and resilience. Huguenot families emphasized literacy, scripture, and moral conduct, seeing education as both a religious duty and a safeguard against persecution. It was in this environment that Abraham's intellectual curiosity first stirred. According to later accounts, Abraham displayed a precocious fascination with numbers. Where other children might have been content with games, he found delight in puzzles, calculations, and the logical beauty of geometry. Family tradition likely introduced him to arithmetic through commerce, as many Huguenots engaged in trade. Numbers were not abstract curiosities, they were tools of survival. Abraham's first true encounter with structured mathematics came when he was introduced to Euclid's Elements, the ancient Greek text that had been the foundation of geometry for centuries. The logical unfolding of axioms into theorems struck him deeply. Unlike theology or politics, riddled with conflict and interpretation, mathematics presented certainty. A line, once drawn, obeyed rules no king or priest could alter. This attraction to order would stay with him all his life. To a boy in a divided land, geometry offered a refuge, a glimpse of universal truth beyond the turmoil of human society. Abraham's formal education was shaped by both local Protestant schools and the broader traditions of French learning. Protestant children often received rigorous instruction in reading, writing, Latin, and moral philosophy. Teachers emphasized clarity of thought and intellectual discipline. In Catholic France, elite schools tied to Jesuit institutions emphasized rhetoric and theology, but Huguenot schools sought to strengthen their community by cultivating scholars, ministers, and professionals who could carry their faith with dignity. Abraham's education would have included classical studies, Latin and possibly some Greek, essential for reading scripture and scholarly texts. Philosophy, early exposure to logic and debate, which later sharpened his analytical abilities. Mathematics, arithmetic, geometry, and the beginnings of algebra, taught as practical skills, but also as a gateway to higher learning. Though little direct documentation survives of his schooling, it is certain that his teachers recognized his unusual aptitude. Accounts suggest that by the time he was 11 or 12, he was already tackling mathematical problems far beyond his peers. As Abraham grew, France itself was undergoing transformation. The reign of Louis XIV, 1643-1715, was defined by grandeur and centralization. The Sun King built Versailles, expanded French influence through wars, and sought to unify his kingdom under Catholicism. For Huguenots, this was a precarious time. Officially tolerated, they were nonetheless subjected to growing restrictions. In some towns, Protestant churches were dismantled. In others, families were pressured to convert. The seeds of persecution had been planted, and they would eventually uproot Abraham's life. This political climate taught him, even in childhood, that identity was fragile. A boy who loved numbers more than conflict could not escape the shadow of faith and politics. His very surname, de Moivre, marked him as part of a community whose future in France was increasingly uncertain. What set Abraham apart was not only raw talent, but curiosity. He constantly asked questions: why numbers behaved in certain ways, why a probability emerged from chance, why a geometric proof must hold. Teachers reportedly found him restless, unwilling to accept tradition without demonstration. This spirit placed him in the lineage of Renaissance thinkers who valued reason over authority. In a world where doctrine often dictated truth, de Moivre leaned toward evidence and logic. Already, the seeds of the Enlightenment were taking root in his young mind. Though remembered today for bringing order to chance, young Abraham experienced uncertainty firsthand. The whispers of religious strife reached even Vitry. Families debated whether to remain steadfast or prepare for exile. Soldiers occasionally appeared to enforce royal decrees. Huguenot children learned early that their lives were subject to forces beyond their control. In this atmosphere, Abraham's focus on mathematics took on symbolic weight. To him, numbers were stable. Even if kings revoked edicts, even if mobs threatened worshippers, a triangle would always sum to 180 degrees. Probability, too, though it dealt with chance, revealed underlying patterns. By studying it, Abraham found a way to confront the unpredictability of existence itself. By the time he reached adolescence, Abraham was already marked as an exceptional student. He had mastered the fundamentals of geometry, delved into algebra, and begun exploring advanced problems. His intellectual confidence grew, even as his family's social security weakened. At around 15, he may have moved to Paris for further study, though evidence is debated. Some sources suggest he attended a Catholic school for a time, forced by circumstance, but retained his Protestant identity. If true, this experience would have further sharpened his sense of being an outsider. Either way, it is clear that by his late teens, Abraham de Moivre was on the cusp of becoming a mathematician. Yet history would not allow him to mature peacefully in his homeland. The storm of persecution was about to break. In 1685, when Abraham was 18, Louis XIV issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, revoking the Edict of Nantes. Suddenly, Protestantism was outlawed. Churches were destroyed, ministers exiled, children taken from their families to be raised as Catholics. For Abraham, this moment was decisive. Remaining in France meant either forced conversion or persecution. Like hundreds of thousands of other Huguenots, he chose exile. It was a painful decision, but one that would ultimately shape his destiny. Leaving behind the vineyards and streets of Champagne, the young scholar embarked on a journey that would carry him across the Channel, into a foreign land, and toward the world of Newton, Halley, and the Royal Society. But before we follow him into exile, we must pause and reflect on the boy he was, a child of faith, a lover of numbers, and a mind already beginning to perceive that behind chance lay structure, behind uncertainty lay patterns, and behind exile lay opportunity. By the late 17th century, France was at once dazzling and dangerous. The grandeur of Louis XIV's Versailles radiated across Europe, but beneath the gilded surface lay tensions that threatened to consume entire communities. For the Huguenots, French Protestants like the de Moivre family, life was becoming increasingly precarious. Although the Edict of Nantes, 1598, had once granted Protestants the right to worship and hold certain civic positions, it was always fragile. Catholic clergy and royal ministers viewed it as a blemish on national unity. As the Sun King sought absolute authority, religious pluralism became intolerable. In towns like Vitry-le-François, where Abraham was raised, suspicion of Protestants simmered. Local officials enforced restrictions on their schools, marriages, and property rights. Protestants were barred from many professions. Every year, the walls closed in further. The turning point came with the infamous Dragonnades, a brutal policy introduced in the 1682. Louis XIV stationed dragoons, mounted soldiers, in Protestant households. The soldiers were not there for defense, but for harassment, eating families out of their homes, destroying property, and pressuring them to convert. Reports of brutality circulated widely, forced conversions at sword point, children taken from parents, ministers imprisoned. It was a campaign of intimidation disguised as re-Catholicization. The message was clear: France would have one king, one law, one faith. For young Abraham de Moivre, still in his teens, these events would have been terrifying. His family, like countless others, faced the impossible choice: abandon their faith or abandon their homeland. In 1685, the hammer fell. The Edict of Fontainebleau revoked the Edict of Nantes and outlawed Protestantism. Protestant churches were demolished, schools shuttered, and worship punished by imprisonment or worse. Ministers were given 2 weeks to leave France. Lay people were forbidden to emigrate on pain of imprisonment in galleys or convents. But people left anyway. Entire families fled in secret, disguising themselves, bribing officials, crossing borders under cover of night. It was one of the greatest refugee crises of early modern Europe, scattering hundreds of thousands of Huguenots across the continent. For Abraham, now 18, this moment determined his destiny. He could not remain a Protestant in France and hope for an intellectual future. He, too, would join the exodus. Historians often remark that France's persecution of the Huguenots was an act of self-sabotage. Those who fled carried with them skills in trade, crafts, banking, science, and the arts. In places like the Netherlands, England, and Prussia, Huguenot refugees revitalized local economies. Among them were great minds: physicians, engineers, merchants, and mathematicians. Abraham de Moivre belonged to this wave of displaced brilliance. What France rejected, England would gain. Details of Abraham's escape are sparse, but like many Huguenot refugees, he likely traveled first to the Netherlands, a Protestant stronghold and staging point for journeys to England. From there, he crossed the Channel to London, a city that was already filling with French exile. Imagine the journey. A young man, thin, determined, carrying little more than a few belongings and a mind trained in Euclid. Behind him, the vineyards and churches of Champagne receded into memory. Ahead lay uncertainty. Would England welcome him? Would he find work, or be lost in the crowded streets of a foreign city? For all the hardship, exile also opened a door. In France, a Huguenot mathematician could expect little but persecution. In England, he would discover freedom to think, to write, and to carve out a place, though never without struggle. Arriving in London in the late 1682, Abraham encountered a city alive with commerce and contradiction. Its streets echoed with multiple languages: English, Dutch, French, Italian, spoken by traders and refugees alike. Coffee houses buzzed with debates on science, politics, and philosophy. The Royal Society, only decades old, gathered some of the greatest minds of the age. For a young refugee, survival was the first priority. De Moivre turned to tutoring. Mathematics was a valuable skill, especially for the sons of merchants and nobles. He taught arithmetic, geometry, and eventually probability. Word of his skill spread slowly, earning him enough to live, though never comfortably. Tutoring also gave him access to circles of wealth and influence. Some of his students introduced him to scholars, and in time his reputation reached figures like Edmund Halley and Isaac Newton. But in those first years, he was still a stranger in a foreign land, surviving lesson by lesson. Exile left deep marks on De Moivre's character. He never fully belonged in England. Always the Frenchman, the outsider, with an accent and a foreign faith. Yet he also no longer belonged to France, which had cast him out. This dual alienation made him cautious, reserved, and sometimes melancholy. But it also sharpened his resilience. De Moivre poured his energies into mathematics, perhaps because numbers offered a home no king could revoke. Equations did not care about nationality. Probability did not discriminate between Catholic and Protestant. In mathematics, he found belonging. De Moivre was not alone. London's Huguenot community became one of the largest in the world, with French churches, schools, and guilds. Refugees supported one another, creating a network of artisans, merchants, and scholars. For Abraham, this community offered both stability and opportunity. He could speak his native French among fellow exiles, share the burden of displacement, and draw strength from a people determined to rebuild their lives. Within this network, his intellectual gifts began to stand out. By the mid-1690 seconds, De Moivre was beginning to publish short papers and make contacts with leading English scientists. His mathematical training, though interrupted by exile, had not been wasted. He still carried within him the rigor of Euclid and the curiosity of his youth. Exile had transformed him from a provincial boy into a cosmopolitan thinker, forced to adapt, survive, and persist. It gave him perspective. Life was fragile, chance was real, and probability mattered. In this crucible of hardship, the mathematician who would write The Doctrine of Chances was forged. When Abraham de Moivre first set foot in London in the late 1680s, the city must have appeared both promising and overwhelming. The Thames flowed thick with commerce, its docks crowded with ships from every corner of the globe. Narrow streets bustled with vendors, beggars, apprentices, and aristocrats in carriages. For a young refugee carrying little more than his education and determination, London was at once a refuge and a labyrinth. The city was still recovering from catastrophe, the Great Fire of 1666 and the Plague of 1665 had scarred its memory, yet it was also a city of rebirth. New churches designed by Christopher Wren rose from the ashes. Coffee houses buzzed with conversation, and the Royal Society was forging a new era of science. But to Abraham, a displaced Huguenot with no wealth or patron, survival came first. He had to earn a living before he could dream of making a name in mathematics. Tutoring became De Moivre's lifeline. Mathematics was increasingly valued in England for navigation, trade, and engineering, and wealthy families sought tutors for their sons. De Moivre, with his French education and sharp mind, fit the role. He taught Euclidean geometry, algebra, and arithmetic to boys preparing for university or careers in commerce. Some lessons were held in candlelit parlors, others in noisy taverns where students drank more than they studied. Payment was irregular and income precarious. He never rose above modest comfort, often living hand to mouth, yet tutoring had an unintended advantage. It connected him with influential families. Some students introduced him to scholars, and word of his skill began to spread quietly through London's intellectual circles. London's coffee houses were more than places to drink, they were centers of intellectual exchange. Writers, merchants, philosophers, and scientists gathered to argue and debate. For the price of a penny, one could spend hours in heated discussion. De Moivre often visited these establishments, carrying mathematical texts under his arm. At first he was a quiet observer, listening to conversations about politics, philosophy, and science. Gradually, he began to contribute. His sharpness in solving problems and his calm, rational explanations earned him notice. It was in one of these coffee houses, legend has it, that De Moivre first caught the attention of Edmund Halley, the astronomer who would later become one of his closest allies. Despite these opportunities, De Moivre remained a stranger. His French accent marked him as an outsider. His religion separated him from the Anglican mainstream. Though London welcomed refugees, prejudice lingered. Many Englishmen saw the Huguenots as competitors for jobs, or as perpetual foreigners who would never truly belong. De Moivre carried himself with dignity, but the weight of alienation pressed upon him. He never fully integrated into English society, nor could he return to France. This sense of being between worlds, neither fully French nor fully English, colored his life and gave him a reserved, sometimes melancholy demeanor. One pivotal moment in his London years came when De Moivre encountered Isaac Newton's Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, 1687. Written in dense Latin, it was nearly impenetrable to most readers, but De Moivre devoured it. He was said to carry pages of the Principia in his pocket, studying them during idle moments, even while waiting for pupils. The work's complexity thrilled him. He longed to master Newton's mathematics of motion and gravitation. This dedication impressed his peers. In time, Newton himself came to respect De Moivre's grasp of his theories. Later stories recount Newton telling visitors, "Go to De Moivre. He knows all this better than I do." Whether apocryphal or not, the anecdote reflects the genuine esteem Newton held for him. De Moivre's growing reputation culminated in his election to the Royal Society in 1697. For a refugee with no official position, this was a remarkable achievement. It placed him among the greatest minds of the age: Newton, Halley, Wren, and others. Yet even this recognition did not solve his financial troubles. Fellowship brought prestige, not income. De Moivre remained dependent on tutoring, still navigating the fragile line between scholarly respect and economic insecurity. As his expertise in probability became known, De Moivre found an unusual source of clients: gamblers. London was a city addicted to chance cards, dice, lotteries, wagers on horse races. Wealthy men who risked fortunes sought De Moivre's guidance in calculating odds. He applied his growing theories of probability to their questions, sometimes providing insights that allowed them to gamble more intelligently. Ironically, while De Moivre himself never grew rich, others profited from his calculations. His later book, The Doctrine of Chances, would become both a scientific text and a gambler's manual. Through these years, De Moivre lived modestly. He owned few possessions, dressed plainly, and worked tirelessly. His world was one of parchment, ink, and candlelight, endless calculations scribbled in cramped handwriting. He had no patron to elevate him, no university chair to secure his position. What he possessed was intellect and persistence. Slowly, quietly, he built a reputation as a man of deep knowledge and unshakable logic. The outsider from Champagne had begun to carve his place in England's scientific world. Abraham de Moivre's first years in England were marked by struggle and survival. A refugee, tutor, and perpetual outsider, he lived by his wits in a city both vibrant and indifferent. Yet within this precarious existence, he laid the foundations of his career. Coffee houses, tutoring sessions, and chance encounters drew him into the orbit of Newton and Halley. He remained poor, but his reputation grew. In the margins of society, he discovered the mathematics of chance, a subject that reflected both his own uncertain life and the deeper patterns of the universe. From these humble beginnings, de Moivre would rise to write the work that defined his legacy, the doctrine of chances. But before that, he would refine his ideas, deepen his ties to England's scientific elite, and carve order out of uncertainty. By the turn of the 18th century, Abraham de Moivre had already begun to earn the respect of England's scientific elite. He had been elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, 1697, corresponded with Edmund Halley, and impressed none other than Isaac Newton with his grasp of advanced mathematics. And yet, despite these accomplishments, de Moivre remained financially insecure. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he never received a university professorship, a royal pension, or an endowed position. He spent his life tutoring, consulting gamblers, and publishing works that earned him intellectual prestige but little money. This paradox fame in theory, obscurity in life, would define his career. To understand de Moivre's plight, one must appreciate the academic climate of 18th century England. Positions in mathematics were scarce and often reserved for those who had studied at Oxford or Cambridge, institutions closed to most outsiders. Patronage mattered as much as intellect. Advancement often depended on connections, politics, or religious conformity. As a French Huguenot refugee, de Moivre had none of these advantages. He was barred by nationality and faith from the smooth paths available to native scholars. While Englishmen like Halley rose to prominent posts, Halley became Astronomer Royal in 1720, de Moivre remained outside the academic establishment. Thus, tutoring became not just his first job in London, but his lifelong profession. Tutoring, in theory, offered steady income. In practice, it was unpredictable and exhausting. Students came and went, payments were often delayed, and lessons were subject to the whims of families. De Moivre taught geometry, algebra, and the basics of Newtonian physics to the sons of merchants and aristocrats. Sometimes he worked with gifted pupils who grasped concepts quickly. Other times he endured sessions with disinterested young men who cared more for gambling or fashion than mathematics. His patience and clarity won him admiration, but the work was unglamorous. It was said that de Moivre, even in old age, could often be found in coffee houses with a copy of Newton's Principia in his pocket, waiting for a student or client. He would pull out a few pages and study them while time passed. This image, a genius reading between tutoring sessions in public houses, captures the precarious dignity of his life. London was a city of chance and speculation. Taverns and private clubs hosted endless games of dice and cards, lotteries flourished, even financial markets carried an air of gambling. De Moivre's expertise in probability made him a sought-after advisor. Gamblers approached him to calculate odds, hoping mathematics could tilt fortune in their favor. Investors, too, consulted him about annuities and life expectancies, early forms of actuarial science. His later work, Annuities Upon Lives, 1725, would formalize these calculations. Ironically, while others used his insights to win money, de Moivre himself never became wealthy. He seemed less interested in applying probability to enrich himself than in uncovering its theoretical beauty. For him, mathematics was a calling, not a scheme. De Moivre's reputation grew through his publications. His papers on probability, infinite series, and complex numbers gained attention in Europe. His landmark book, The Doctrine of Chances, 1718, became both a cornerstone of probability theory and a manual for gamblers. But here, too, he faced frustration. Scientific publishing in the early 18th century rarely paid authors. At best, it enhanced prestige. Without a patron or university salary, de Moivre gained little material benefit from his groundbreaking work. His ideas spread widely, but his own purse remained thin. De Moivre's personal relationships with Newton and Halley highlight the strange duality of his career. Newton respected him, consulted him on difficult problems, and even entrusted him with clarifying passages of the Principia. Halley, a practical astronomer and mathematician, encouraged de Moivre's work and praised his insights. Yet admiration from giants did not translate into security. Newton had a royal post at the Mint. Halley became Astronomer Royal. De Moivre continued to tutor. His brilliance was recognized, but not institutionalized. This may reflect not only prejudice against foreigners, but also de Moivre's reserved personality. He was neither a courtier nor a political operator. He lacked the charm or ambition to lobby for positions. His life reveals the harsh truth that intellectual merit alone rarely guaranteed success in the 18th century. Accounts of de Moivre's personal life portray him as modest, solitary, and disciplined. He never married, perhaps because poverty made family life impractical. He lodged in modest rooms, lived frugally, and devoted his hours to study. Visitors recalled his penetrating eyes, his calm voice, and his habit of slipping into mathematical digressions in conversation. He found pleasure in ideas rather than possessions. Books, not furniture, filled his rooms. Numbers, not wealth, structured his days. And yet this very modesty deepened the aura of tragedy around him. Here was a man who unlocked the mathematics of chance, who anticipated the normal distribution, who bridged trigonometry and complex numbers, yet who died in poverty, largely forgotten by the wider public. De Moivre's obscurity was not total within scientific circles. His reputation was secure. But beyond them, he remained a shadow figure, known more for anecdotes, like his death prediction, than for his actual achievements. Unlike Newton, who became a national icon, or Halley, whose comet immortalized him in popular memory, de Moivre never captured the public imagination in life. His foreignness, his lack of patronage, and his quiet personality conspired against him. And yet, paradoxically, it was obscurity that gave him freedom. Without obligations to a university or court, he could pursue the mathematics that fascinated him. His isolation protected him from the political quarrels that consumed other scholars. In his solitude, he produced work that shaped the future of statistics and probability. By the end of the 17th century, London's intellectual life revolved around the Royal Society and the towering figure of Isaac Newton. For Abraham de Moivre, a refugee tutor surviving on odd lessons, to gain recognition in this circle was both improbable and extraordinary. And yet, through persistence, talent, and reputation, he entered it. By 1697, de Moivre was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, a remarkable achievement for a foreign-born Huguenot with no university chair. This membership gave him access to the very heart of English science, the debates, demonstrations, and publications that shaped the Enlightenment. It was here that de Moivre's connections with Newton and Halley deepened. By the time de Moivre entered the Royal Society, Newton was already a legend. His Principia Mathematica, 1687, had redefined physics and mathematics. He was revered but also feared, a man of towering intellect and sharp temper, capable of brilliance and bitterness in equal measure. For de Moivre, Newton was both a model and a gatekeeper. Understanding the Principia was itself a challenge. Newton's Latin was dense, his proofs geometrical, his reasoning compressed. Many fellows of the Royal Society, though admiring, admitted they could not follow it. De Moivre, however, had a gift. He could unravel Newton's mathematics and explain it clearly to others. According to anecdotes, he was often consulted by those baffled by the Principia. Even Newton himself, weary of endless explanations, is said to have remarked, "Go to de Moivre. He knows all this better than I do." Though likely exaggerated, the story reflects the genuine esteem Newton held for him. De Moivre became, in effect, a translator of Newtonian thought, not linguistically, but mathematically, making Newton's dense work intelligible. If Newton was the distant genius, Edmund Halley was the practical scientist and friend. Halley, remembered today for the comet that bears his name, was a polymath astronomer, geophysicist, and organizer. He had been instrumental in publishing Newton's Principia, advancing funds and encouraging its completion. Halley recognized de Moivre's talent early. The two shared an interest in probability and mortality statistics, crucial for the growing field of life annuities. Together, they discussed methods for calculating life expectancy, a subject with both scientific and financial importance in a London teeming with investors and insurers. Their conversations helped push de Moivre toward his later work, Annuities Upon Lives, 1725, which applied mathematical rigor to actuarial science. Halley provided the institutional connection. De Moivre provided the analytical clarity. The Royal Society of de Moivre's time was a curious blend of aristocrats, experimenters, and intellectuals. Its motto, nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, captured the spirit of inquiry. Members demonstrated experiments, debated theories, and published papers in the Philosophical Transactions. For de Moivre, the society was both an opportunity and a challenge. He gained access to its library, its discussions, and its network of scholars. But as a foreigner with limited English, he had to work harder than others to prove himself. His mathematical papers on probability, infinite series, and trigonometric relations began appearing in the Transactions. Though not always headline-making, they established him as a serious contributor. He became known as the quiet, precise mathematician who explained difficult ideas with elegance. De Moivre entered the Royal Society during the heated priority dispute between Newton and Leibniz over the invention of calculus. This feud divided the mathematical world. English mathematicians, under Newton's influence, closed ranks and often isolated themselves from continental innovations. De Moivre, though French-born, aligned firmly with Newton. His loyalty earned him respect within the society, though it may have limited his ties to European scholars who favored Leibniz. Still, his allegiance was pragmatic. Newton's circle provided him with the recognition and support he desperately needed. Beyond anecdotes, de Moivre's role as an interpreter of Newton was crucial. He produced simplified explanations of Newton's results, rephrased proofs, and offered new notations. His own discoveries, such as de Moivre's formula linking complex numbers and trigonometry, were partly inspired by Newtonian methods, but extended them in new directions. In this way, de Moivre did not merely echo Newton, he amplified him. He acted as a bridge, carrying Newtonian mathematics into broader circulation, especially among students and readers less adept at navigating the Principia. Accounts describe de Moivre's visits with Newton in his later years. Newton, by then elderly and revered, often received visitors seeking explanations of his great work. Tired of repeating himself, he sometimes redirected them to de Moivre. To be Newton's recommended interpreter was both an honor and a burden. It confirmed de Moivre's brilliance, but also underscored his secondary status. He was the mathematician behind the curtain, indispensable but rarely spotlighted. Despite his proximity to Newton and Halley, de Moivre's daily life did not change much. He still tutored for income, still waited in coffee houses, still lived modestly. Recognition did not translate into security. Yet these connections gave him intellectual belonging. He was no longer just a refugee tutor, he was part of the greatest scientific circle of his age. In the halls of the Royal Society, in the libraries of London, in the company of Newton and Halley, de Moivre found the community he had lacked in exile. London in the early 18th century was a city obsessed with chance. Taverns rang with the clatter of dice. Coffee houses buzzed with wagers on politics, weather, and war. Aristocrats staked fortunes on card games. Merchants speculated in lotteries and investments. In such an environment, mathematics was not only an abstract pursuit, it was a practical necessity. It was here, among gamblers and speculators, that Abraham de Moivre found both his livelihood and his inspiration. His years of tutoring and consulting gamblers crystallized into a book that would define his legacy, The Doctrine of Chances, 1718. Before de Moivre, the study of probability was still young. Blaise Pascal and Pierre de Fermat had explored problems of gambling in the mid-1,600 seconds, laying foundations. Christian Huygens had written an early treatise in 1657. The Bernoullis on the continent, especially Jacob Bernoulli, were extending probability into law-like patterns. But in England the subject remained fragmented. Gamblers relied on intuition, and investors relied on experience rather than rigorous analysis. De Moivre sought to bring clarity, system, and method to this uncertain world. Published in 1718, The Doctrine of Chances, or A Method of Calculating the Probability of Events in Play, was both scientific treatise and gambler's manual. Written in English, not Latin, it was accessible to a wide audience. The book included basic principles of probability using clear language and examples, card and dice problems, calculating the odds of various hands and outcomes, general rules for dealing with complex cases of chance, applications beyond gaming, hinting at uses in insurance and mortality studies. What made it revolutionary was not only its content, but its methodical rigor. De Moivre treated chance with the same precision as Euclid had treated geometry. At first, the book appealed to gamblers. Wealthy men brought their copies to gaming tables, consulting its pages like an oracle. The very title, The Doctrine of Chances, had the aura of authority. To own it was to seem sophisticated, to gamble with the blessing of mathematics. But the book's deeper significance lay elsewhere. By formalizing probability, de Moivre provided tools that would later shape statistics, insurance, finance, and science itself. Problems once seen as matters of luck could now be studied with laws and patterns. Some of de Moivre's major contributions in the doctrine included general probability rules. He introduced systematic rules for combining probabilities, using algebra to handle complex cases. Binomial distribution approximation. In later editions, de Moivre famously showed how the binomial distribution could be approximated by a curve, what we now recognize as the normal distribution. This insight anticipated the central limit theorem, expected value. He clarified the concept of expected value, essential for evaluating wagers, annuities, and investments. Practical applications. He hinted at uses far beyond gambling, life annuities, insurance, and even the reliability of testimony in courts. In short, the book transformed probability from pastime to science. The doctrine quickly established de Moivre as the leading authority on probability in England. It was reprinted in expanded editions, 1738, 1756, each deepening the theory. European mathematicians took notice, and his work circulated on the continent. Yet the reception was double-edged. Gamblers loved the book but rarely respected its author. Scholars admired it but often cited Bernoulli more prominently. De Moivre once again found himself recognized but not fully celebrated. It is a cruel irony that while de Moivre taught others to calculate odds, he himself never profited from chance. He remained poor, his income reliant on tutoring and small fees. His insights enriched gamblers and insurers, but not his own purse. Perhaps this detachment was deliberate. For de Moivre, probability was not about winning money, but about uncovering the patterns of uncertainty. Chance was not chaos, but order disguised. In his equations, he saw the hand of logic guiding even the roll of dice. Though written in the context of games, the doctrine of chances became the foundation of modern probability theory. From it grew actuarial science, calculating life expectancies and annuities. Statistics, using probability to analyze data. Science of error, applying probability to measurement and observation. Later figures Laplace, Gauss, and beyond built on de Moivre's framework. The bell curve, the language of expected value, the very idea of probability as a mathematical discipline all owed much to this modest refugee tutor. Early 18th century London was addicted to gambling. Taverns echoed with the roll of dice, aristocrats wagered on horse races, merchants speculated in lotteries, and even Parliament was rumored to make side bets on political outcomes. Betting was not a vice confined to the poor or reckless, it was a cultural phenomenon embraced by all classes. For a mathematician like Abraham de Moivre, this was fertile ground. Gambling gave his probability theory both relevance and clientele. Yet it also revealed the paradox of human nature. People wanted certainty and chance, but rarely followed logic when money and passion were at stake. De Moivre's reputation as the oracle of odds spread among London's gamblers. Wealthy men approached him before high-stakes games of cards or dice, asking for calculations of risk. He would scribble probabilities on scraps of paper, showing the precise chances of a particular hand or outcome. Some gamblers used his advice wisely, limiting reckless wagers. Others misunderstood or ignored it, gambling wildly despite his numbers. And a few tried to employ his formulas dishonestly, using them to design games skewed in their favor. De Moivre himself remained detached. He saw gambling as an illustration of mathematical truths, not as a path to wealth. He never tried to enrich himself at the tables. For him, dice and cards were experiments, living laboratories of chance. De Moivre understood something profound about human behavior. While mathematics could reveal the odds, people rarely obeyed numbers when emotions entered. The thrill of risk often outweighed rational calculation. The superstition of luck clashed with the logic of probability. Winners attributed success to skill, losers to fate, ignoring the real mathematics at play. This tension fascinated him. In his writings, he noted that probability was not merely a tool for winning games, but a science of human behavior, exposing how often reason surrendered to passion. During de Moivre's lifetime, the English state itself fueled gambling through lotteries. To finance wars and public projects, the government sold lottery tickets, offering enormous prizes. Citizens of every class participated, dreaming of instant fortune. De Moivre analyzed these lotteries, calculating expected values, and pointing out that most players were destined to lose, yet the lure of riches was irresistible. In this, he saw a wider application of his science. Probability could unmask illusions of wealth, showing that what seemed generous often hid mathematical traps. Stories circulated of men who won or lost fortunes overnight. Aristocrats gambled away estates. Merchants staked their businesses on cards. Some, having consulted de Moivre, knew the risks, yet played anyway. One tale tells of a nobleman who insisted that de Moivre calculate the odds of his favorite dice game. When told that the chances were stacked against him, he shrugged and declared, "Then let the devil take the odds I play for pleasure." Such episodes revealed to de Moivre the limits of mathematics in the face of human will. Probability could explain chance, but it could not control desire. Though gamblers sought him out, de Moivre increasingly saw that probability had applications far beyond play. In the doctrine of chances, he hinted that the same principles could be applied to life expectancy, foundations of actuarial science, reliability of evidence in law courts, predicting events in nature, and scientific experiments. Thus, while gambling gave probability its immediate context, de Moivre saw it as a universal science of uncertainty. Gambling raised moral questions that de Moivre could not ignore. As a Protestant exile, he lived within a community that often viewed gaming as sinful, and yet his mathematics was bound to it. De Moivre resolved this tension by distinguishing between mathematics as truth and gambling as practice. His work, he believed, revealed eternal laws of chance. How men used those laws wisely or foolishly was their responsibility. In this way, he could serve gamblers without condoning gambling itself. If one mathematical expression has immortalized Abraham de Moivre, it is this: cos theta plus I sin thetan equals cosine nth plus I synth. Known simply as de Moivre's formula, it elegantly connects complex numbers with trigonometry. To students today, it appears in textbooks as a neat identity. But in de Moivre's time, it was a profound insight, a glimpse of a deeper harmony in mathematics. When de Moivre was working, complex numbers involving the square root of negative undenoted I were still controversial. Many mathematicians viewed them with suspicion, calling them imaginary. They appeared useful in solving equations but lacked clear interpretation. At the same time, trigonometry was largely practical, used in navigation, astronomy, and surveying. Few saw it as connected to algebraic structures like powers and roots. De Moivre's formula revealed that these seemingly separate domains were intimately linked. De Moivre first introduced his formula in his work on trigonometric expansions around the turn of the 18th century. Initially, he used it as a tool for simplifying the calculation of multiple angle trigonometric identities. For example, by expanding cos theta plus I sin thetan using the binomial theorem, he noticed that the real and imaginary parts neatly corresponded to cosine nth and sine nth. What looked like algebraic coincidence was, in fact, a universal law. It was a revelation. Powers of complex numbers traced trigonometric cycles. The two worlds of mathematics, geometry of angles, and algebra of powers were fused by a single identity. De Moivre's formula quickly became a powerful tool. Trigonometric identities, it provided a simple way to derive multiple angle formulas, such as expressions for cosine 3 theta or sine 5 theta, roots of equations. It gave methods for finding the nth roots of complex numbers, a step toward solving polynomial equations, astronomy, and physics. By simplifying trigonometric calculations, it aided in problems of celestial mechanics, then a booming field under Newton and Halley. To contemporaries, this was both practical and profound. The formula also had deeper implications. It suggested that complex numbers were not just convenient fictions, but part of a coherent system. They obeyed rules that connected directly with geometry. This helped shift perception. The imaginary began to look real, though it would take Euler, Gauss, and others to fully embrace complex numbers. De Moivre's work was a crucial milestone. De Moivre's formula inspired Leonhard Euler, who in the 1740 reformulated it as his famous identity. A theta equals cos theta plus I sin theta, a direct generalization of de Moivre's insight. Carl Friedrich Gauss, who used it in his foundational work on complex analysis. Modern mathematics, where the formula remains essential in Fourier analysis, signal processing, and quantum mechanics. Without de Moivre, Euler's identity, the so-called most beautiful formula in mathematics, might never have emerged in the same way. It is striking that a man who lived his life in poverty, tutoring for pennies, created a formula now carved into the very foundation of mathematics. De Moivre may not have secured wealth or fame, but in writing down this identity, he achieved what monarchs and gamblers could not: immortality through numbers. From dice to distributions. Abraham de Moivre had long been fascinated by dice, cards, and other games of chance. His doctrine of chances was filled with problems about repeated trials, throwing a die many times, drawing cards, or flipping coins. These situations involved the binomial distribution, the probability of a given number of successes in a fixed number of trials. But as the number of trials increased, the calculations became cumbersome. De Moivre asked a deeper question. Could there be a simpler, universal curve that approximated the binomial for large numbers? This inquiry led him to one of his greatest discoveries, the normal distribution or the bell curve. The binomial problem. Consider flipping a coin times. The binomial distribution gives the probability of obtaining exactly point heads. For small point, it is easy to compute, but for large hundreds or thousands of flips, the calculation is overwhelming. De Moivre sought an approximation, a curve that could capture the essential shape of the distribution without needing exact binomial coefficients. De Moivre's discovery was revolutionary. It provided a practical tool for approximating probabilities in complex cases. It suggested that random events followed universal patterns. It laid the groundwork for what later became the central limit theorem, the idea that sums of random variables tend to follow a normal distribution regardless of their original form. Though de Moivre himself did not fully articulate the theorem, he had planted its seeds. At first, de Moivre's approximation attracted limited attention. Probability was still viewed as a niche subject tied to gambling. Yet his insight spread quietly among mathematicians. Pierre-Simon Laplace, decades later, generalized de Moivre's result and formulated the central limit theorem. Carl Friedrich Gauss used the normal curve in his theory of errors, giving it the name Gaussian distribution. Modern statistics, psychology, economics, and natural sciences all built upon the foundation de Moivre had laid. Today, the bell curve is everywhere, from IQ tests to stock markets to measurement error, and de Moivre's role as its first discoverer is finally recognized. It is poignant that a man who lived in uncertainty and insecurity discovered the curve of order in randomness. Exiled, impoverished, and overlooked, de Moivre nonetheless revealed that behind the chaos of chance lay a predictable shape. His bell curve was more than a formula. It was a philosophy. It showed that uncertainty itself could be tamed, that in the long run, patterns emerge from noise, structure from chance. By the 1,720 Abraham de Moivre's reputation as a master of probability was firmly established. Gamblers respected his calculations, scholars admired his rigor, and Newton himself had entrusted him with explaining difficult passages of the Principia. But de Moivre was not content to stop at games of chance. He turned his attention to a far more profound gamble, the length of human life. How long might a man live? How should one price an annuity that promised payments until death? What were the odds that a pensioner would survive another year? These questions were not just philosophical, they were financially urgent in a London bursting with insurance schemes, lotteries, and public debt. De Moivre's answer would establish him as a pioneer of actuarial science. In de Moivre's day, annuities were becoming popular financial instruments. A person could pay a lump sum to the state or a private company in exchange for guaranteed annual payments until death. Governments used annuities to raise money for wars and public projects. Investors saw them as a kind of security. But the key problem was, how much should an annuity cost? Charge too little, and the seller went bankrupt if annuitants lived too long. Charge too much, and no one would buy. A rational method was needed. This was where de Moivre's mathematics came in. De Moivre drew inspiration from his friend Edmund Halley, who in 1693 had published one of the first mortality tables based on records from the German city of Breslau. Halley showed how to use observed data on deaths and survivals to calculate life expectancy. De Moivre simplified and extended this work. In his 1725 book, Annuities Upon Lives, he proposed a straight-line model of mortality. Assume that out of a cohort of people alive at age 0, deaths occur at a steady rate until everyone has died by age 86. This meant that the number of survivors at each age could be approximated by a simple linear decline. This model, while crude by modern standards, made calculations tractable. With it, de Moivre could compute the expected present value of an annuity with remarkable efficiency. De Moivre's method allowed governments, insurers, and individuals to price annuities fairly, balancing risk and return, estimate life expectancy at different ages, plan pensions and long-term financial obligations. Though based on simplifying assumptions, his work brought order to what had previously been guesswork. He gave financiers and statesmen a tool to manage the risk of longevity. What makes Annuities Upon Lives striking is how it blended abstract mathematics with practical finance. De Moivre applied the same probability tools used for dice and cards to the span of human life. In this sense, he showed that probability was not just entertainment or academic curiosity, it was a discipline with power to reshape economies. Modern insurance, pensions, and actuarial science all trace roots to this work. For de Moivre, the study of life annuities was not just about money. As a refugee who had lived through uncertainty, he knew the precariousness of life. Behind every calculation of expected value was a human story. The widow hoping her annuity would sustain her, the government clerk depending on a pension, the merchant planning for old age. Probability gave these stories structure, but de Moivre never lost sight that the subject was life itself. De Moivre's Annuities Upon Lives influenced generations of actuaries and economists. His linear mortality law became a standard model for decades until more refined statistical methods emerged. Later, thinkers such as Gauss in statistics and Malthus in demography built upon the idea that populations could be studied mathematically. The very notion that life expectancy could be quantified owed much to de Moivre's work. Today, the modern insurance industry, pension systems, and actuarial profession can trace part of their genealogy to this modest Huguenot refugee who spent his life tutoring in London coffeehouses. Abraham de Moivre's life was shaped by faith and persecution. Born a Huguenot in Catholic France, he lived through the revocation of the Edict of Nantes and the Dragonnades that drove his family into exile. Faith was not abstract for him, it was survival, identity, and loss. Yet in England, where he rebuilt his life, de Moivre increasingly turned to reason and mathematics as his true compass. His worldview was forged in the tension between religion and rationality. He remained a Protestant, but his writings and habits reveal a man who trusted most in the clarity of logic. Huguenot culture valued discipline, sobriety, and education. From childhood, de Moivre was trained to read, to argue carefully, and to live modestly. These traits stayed with him throughout life. He dressed plainly, lived frugally, and devoted himself to study. But while many Huguenots found comfort in Scripture, de Moivre increasingly found it in mathematics. For him, numbers were not just tools, but a language of truth, a way of grasping the world that transcended sectarian divisions. Where theology divided, mathematics united. Living in London during the early Enlightenment, de Moivre was surrounded by new philosophies of reason. Thinkers like John Locke emphasized empiricism, while Newton's Principia demonstrated the power of mathematical laws to explain the cosmos. De Moivre's own work reflects this spirit. He believed that chance could be studied mathematically, revealing hidden order, that life itself, birth, survival, death, obeyed patterns that reason could uncover, that mathematics was not just abstract but a guide for society, shaping finance, justice, and science. He was, in short, an Enlightenment rationalist, though one tempered by the humility of exile. Despite his rationalism, de Moivre did not abandon faith. As a Huguenot, he remained part of London's French Protestant community, attending services and supporting fellow refugees. His writings occasionally reference providence and the divine order. For him, there was no contradiction between faith and mathematics. Probability itself, he suggested, revealed the laws through which God governed chance. Just as Newton saw divine order in gravitation, de Moivre saw it in probability curves. Thus, his worldview was not atheistic but harmonious. Mathematics was a window into God's rational creation. De Moivre was acutely aware of the gap between reason and behavior. His consulting for gamblers showed him how often men ignored logic in favor of impulse. He observed that while probability could guide wise action, passion often overwhelmed reason. This shaped his philosophy of human nature. Man was capable of rationality, but enslaved by desire. Mathematics offered truth, but few applied it consistently. Thus, society lurched between order and folly. In this, de Moivre anticipated later thinkers in psychology and economics who studied irrational decision-making. Unlike flamboyant philosophers such as Voltaire, de Moivre never sought to dazzle with wit or polemic. His philosophy was quiet, embedded in equations and prefaces. He did not write grand treatises on metaphysics, but instead let his mathematical clarity speak for his worldview. Those who met him noted his calm, measured tone, his tendency to turn discussions back to reason, and his indifference to vanity. To live by numbers, he seemed to suggest, was to live by truth stripped of illusion. Perhaps most striking is how de Moivre thought about death. His work on annuities forced him to confront mortality mathematically. Life expectancy, once a mystery, became a curve. Death, once arbitrary, became part of probability. It is here that legend and philosophy meet. His supposed prediction of his own death, extending his daily sleep by 15 minutes until it reached 24 hours, was less superstition than a metaphor. He saw life itself as subject to calculation, and death as the natural final certainty. For de Moivre, death was not chaos, but completion of the pattern. For all his mathematical brilliance, Abraham de Moivre spent most of his life not as a celebrated professor, but as a tutor for hire. Tutoring was both his livelihood and his identity. From the day he arrived in London as a refugee until his death, he relied on students' fees to survive. This work was often precarious. Wealthy families could be generous, but also fickle. Payments were sometimes delayed. Lessons could be canceled on a whim. Yet de Moivre persevered. His passion for mathematics transformed tutoring from drudgery into a mission. De Moivre was a familiar figure in London's coffee houses, which doubled as informal classrooms. With a few sheets of paper and a quill, he would explain Euclidean geometry, algebra, or Newtonian physics to his pupils amid the murmur of debates and the smell of tobacco and coffee. Students recalled his clarity. He could take a dense passage from Newton's Principia and make it understandable. He avoided flamboyance, preferring slow, steady reasoning. His lessons were like his personality, measured, calm, and precise. To many pupils, he was not only a teacher of numbers, but also an example of intellectual discipline. The range of his students. His students came from varied backgrounds, sons of merchants and aristocrats preparing for university or careers in finance, aspiring scientists eager to grasp Newtonian mechanics, gamblers and speculators who wanted lessons in probability to sharpen their play. Some students pursued mathematics seriously. Others treated lessons as fashionable accomplishments. For all of them, de Moivre gave the same dedication, though he sometimes lamented the frivolity of those who valued appearances more than truth. One of de Moivre's most important roles was as an interpreter of Newton. Many students, and even fellows of the Royal Society, struggled with the Principia. Its geometrical proofs were daunting. De Moivre broke it down into algebraic methods and simpler steps. His ability to clarify Newton's work earned him respect not only among students, but also among scholars. Newton himself, weary of repeating explanations, is said to have sent confused visitors to de Moivre with the words, "He knows all this better than I do." Thus, through teaching, de Moivre became a conduit of Newtonian science, ensuring its spread beyond a narrow elite. Accounts of de Moivre's teaching emphasize his patience. He did not ridicule mistakes but carefully corrected them, guiding students to the right answer. He encouraged questions, seeing them as signs of engagement. His handwriting was small and meticulous, his diagrams carefully drawn. He insisted on rigor but never rushed. For him, mathematics was not about speed but clarity of understanding. In this, he stood apart from more flamboyant tutors who dazzled but did not instruct. De Moivre built solid foundations, brick by brick. While many students treated his lessons as passing exercises, a few absorbed his methods deeply and went on to contribute to mathematics and science. Though their names may not shine as brightly as Newton's or Halley's, they carried forward the discipline of reasoning he embodied. Moreover, even students who did not become mathematicians benefited. Merchants applied his lessons in bookkeeping and finance. Gamblers learned the meaning of risk. Future statesmen gained respect for the power of rational thought. In this way, de Moivre's influence spread not just through his writings, but through generations of pupils who carried fragments of his clarity into their own lives. Despite his fame among London's intellectuals, de Moivre never rose above modest means. He tutored until his final years, often arriving at lessons weak and weary. His students sometimes remarked on his worn clothes, his simple meals, his air of quiet fatigue, yet they also sensed his dignity. He never begged for patronage, never compromised his integrity. He taught with the same seriousness whether his pupil was a nobleman or a common merchant. To him, knowledge was sacred, not a commodity to be cheapened. By the mid-18th century, Abraham de Moivre was widely recognized in mathematical circles. He had written The Doctrine of Chances, Annuities upon Lives, and introduced the formula that bore his name. He was respected by Newton, befriended by Halley, and cited by scholars in England and on the continent. And yet he remained poor. Recognition brought him prestige, but not income. Unlike Newton, who became Master of the Mint, or Halley, who secured the post of Astronomer Royal, de Moivre never obtained a salaried academic or governmental position. His life was a paradox, a man whose ideas shaped the future of probability and statistics, yet who struggled daily to pay rent and buy food. The financial plight of de Moivre reflects the broader economics of scholarship in his time. Scientific publishing rarely paid authors. The Royal Society offered status but not salary. University positions were scarce and often closed to foreigners or dissenters. De Moivre, a French Huguenot exile, lacked patrons with political power. He did not flatter nobles or seek aristocratic favor. His modesty and plainness worked against him in a society where advancement often depended on connections as much as talent. Thus, tutoring remained his only steady income, a precarious profession that kept him in constant financial uncertainty. Accounts from contemporary describe de Moivre's austere lifestyle. He lodged in simple, sometimes shabby rooms. His clothes were plain and worn. He often skipped meals when tutoring income was scarce. He carried pages of Newton's Principia in his pocket, studying them in coffee houses while waiting for pupils, an image both of diligence and quiet poverty. Even in old age, when his body weakened, he continued tutoring to survive. Mathematics was his life's work, but it was also his bread. There was bitter irony in his situation. De Moivre had shown governments how to price annuities, enabling them to profit from managing risk and longevity. His work on probability laid the foundation for insurance and finance industries that would generate enormous wealth. Yet he himself saw little of that wealth. The man who taught others how to measure fortune remained unfortunate. This irony was not lost on him. He occasionally remarked, half in jest, that while others gained riches from his formulas, he gained only the satisfaction of knowing the truth. Though poor, de Moivre was not without friends. Newton respected him deeply. Halley supported his publications. Other fellows of the Royal Society admired his work. In his final years, admirers sometimes provided small gifts or assistance, but charity never replaced the dignity of secure income. De Moivre bore poverty with quiet stoicism, never complaining loudly, never begging. He accepted hardship as part of his fate, turning instead to the certainty of numbers. Poverty shaped his personality. He became cautious, reserved, and deeply disciplined. Every penny mattered. Every hour of tutoring had to be used wisely. His modest lifestyle reinforced his reputation as a man of integrity, untouched by vanity, devoted wholly to mathematics. Yet poverty also limited him. He never traveled widely, never built a school of disciples, never established a household. His legacy, therefore, lived more in his books than in institutions or monuments. When Abraham de Moivre published The Doctrine of Chances in 1718, probability was still a young and uncertain science. Born from gambling problems in the 17th century, it was not yet seen as a universal mathematical discipline. De Moivre's work provided not only formulas, but also a framework, a way to treat chance with the same rigor as geometry. Though he died poor, his ideas lived on, shaping the direction of mathematics for centuries. On the continent, the Bernoulli family of mathematicians were deeply engaged with probability. Jacob Bernoulli's Ars Conjectandi, 1713, had introduced the law of large numbers. De Moivre's work complemented and extended this, offering practical methods and approximations. The Bernoulli recognized de Moivre's clarity. His approximation of the binomial distribution by the normal curve was a direct extension of their ideas and a bridge to future developments. Perhaps the greatest heir to de Moivre's probability legacy was Pierre-Simon Laplace. In the late 18th century, Laplace generalized de Moivre's normal approximation and fully articulated the central limit theorem, the principle that sums of random variables tend toward the normal distribution. Laplace explicitly acknowledged de Moivre's contribution. What de Moivre hinted at, Laplace proved in full generality. Without de Moivre's pioneering step, the theorem that underpins modern statistics might have taken much longer to emerge. In the early 19th century, Carl Friedrich Gauss applied the normal distribution originally introduced by de Moivre to the study of errors in measurement. Gauss showed that the bell curve described how observational errors clustered around the true value. This gave the normal distribution a central role in physics, astronomy, and experimental science. Today, it is often called the Gaussian distribution, but its first discoverer was de Moivre. De Moivre's annuities upon lives influenced not just mathematicians, but also actuaries and financiers. His linear mortality law, though simplified, became a standard tool for pricing annuities and life insurance. Later actuaries refined his models with better data, but the principle that life expectancy could be quantified owed much to him. Modern actuarial science traces part of its genealogy to de Moivre's calculations. Before de Moivre, probability was tied to gambling. After him, it became a general science of uncertainty. His work suggested that probability applied to human life, mortality, and annuities, finance, lotteries, investments, science, errors of observation, patterns in data. This broader vision paved the way for statistics, econometrics, and data science. In a sense, de Moivre transformed chance from pastime to principle. For a long time, de Moivre's contributions were overshadowed by Newton's prestige and by later giants like Laplace and Gauss. But modern historians of mathematics now emphasize his pivotal role. They recognize him as the first to write probability systematically in English, the first to introduce the normal distribution, the man who bridged gambling and actuarial finance, a key transmitter of Newtonian science. His legacy, once obscured by poverty, now shines as foundational. It is striking that a refugee, denied a university chair, and condemned to tutor in coffee houses, reshaped the science of uncertainty. His legacy in probability is a testament to resilience. Exile silenced his voice in France, but England became the stage where his ideas flourished. Through his formulas, he gave humanity a way to measure the unmeasurable, to bring clarity to the very concept of chance. Abraham de Moivre is remembered for many mathematical achievements, but to the wider public, his most enduring story is not about the normal curve or de Moivre's formula. It is the tale that, late in life, he noticed he was sleeping 15 minutes longer each night. By his calculation, when this pattern reached 24 hours, he would never wake again. He predicted the date the 27th of November, 1754, and indeed, on that day, he died. The image is haunting, a mathematician calmly calculating his own end, treating death as an equation. But is it true? Origins of the story. The tale first appeared in 18th century biographical notes and was repeated by later historians. Some accounts came from acquaintances who claimed to have heard it from de Moivre himself. Others may have embellished the story after his death, fitting it into the narrative of a man who lived by numbers. It is difficult to know how much is fact and how much is myth. What is clear is that by the late 18th century, the anecdote was firmly attached to his name, shaping his memory for generations. Several interpretations are possible. Literal truth. De Moivre actually noticed a steady increase in sleep and projected its outcome. If so, the accuracy of his prediction may have been coincidence. Exaggerated observation. Perhaps he mentioned feeling increasingly tired, and someone dramatized it into a mathematical sequence. Metaphor. The story may have been a parable created by admirers, a way of expressing that de Moivre, who quantified chance and life itself, even measured his own death. Whether true or not, the anecdote reflects his identity as a mathematician of chance. Regardless of the tale's accuracy, de Moivre did die on the 27th of November 1754 in London at the age of 87. He was buried at Street Martin in the Fields. For a man who had lived in exile, struggled with poverty, and found solace only in numbers, his passing was quiet, marked not by public mourning but by the respect of mathematicians who recognized his greatness. The death prediction anecdote ensured he would be remembered by a wider audience, though more as a curiosity than as a scientist. Why did the story endure? Because it captured the essence of his life. He lived by calculation. He faced uncertainty with reason. He treated even death as a subject of probability. For admirers, it was poetic justice that the man who tamed chance seemed to tame his own mortality. For skeptics, it was simply a coincidence wrapped in myth. Either way, the story served as a symbol of rational mastery over fate. The anecdote also highlights the tension in de Moivre's legacy. He was a man of reason, uncovering laws of chance and life expectancy, yet he was remembered through a mystery, a story that blurred fact and fiction. This duality reflects the human fascination with mathematics itself. We seek certainty, yet we are drawn to the mystical aura of those who wield it. Modern historians tend to view the death prediction story with caution. It likely grew from a kernel of truth, his complaints of fatigue embellished into legend. But they also recognize its value. It keeps his memory alive, reminding us that mathematics is not just equations, but also narrative, imagination, and myth. Abraham de Moivre lived in the age of giants. Newton revolutionized physics. Leibniz created a new calculus and a philosophy of optimism. The Bernoulli explored probability, calculus, and fluid dynamics. Huygens laid early foundations for games of chance and mechanics. Against this backdrop, de Moivre often seemed to stand in the second row, not because his ideas were lesser, but because his position as a refugee tutor denied him the institutional power and fame of his peers. Yet, when judged by his actual contributions, he belongs firmly in their company. Christian Huygens, the Dutch polymath, published De Ratiociniis in Ludo Allier in 1657, the first book on probability. Huygens approached gambling problems systematically, introducing concepts like expected value. De Moivre built on this foundation, extending probability far beyond games. Where Huygens opened the door, De Moivre built the house, providing general methods, normal approximations, and applications to finance. In scope and rigor, De Moivre surpassed Huygens. The Bernoulli family dominated mathematics in Switzerland. Jacob Bernoulli's Ars Conjectandi, 1713, introduced the law of large numbers, while Johann Bernoulli advanced calculus and analysis. De Moivre's doctrine of chances complemented Jacob's work. Jacob showed that long-term averages converged to probabilities. De Moivre showed how binomial probabilities approximated a universal curve. Together, they laid the twin pillars of modern probability: convergence and distribution. The Bernoullis, however, had academic posts and networks. De Moivre, working in isolation in London, lacked their visibility. His genius unfolded in obscurity, while their names became widely celebrated. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, co-inventor of calculus, was a philosopher, diplomat, and polymath. His influence spread across Europe. De Moivre was not a system builder like Leibniz. He lacked the broad philosophical ambitions, but where Leibniz crafted vast theories, De Moivre crafted precise tools. His formula for powers of complex numbers, his annuity model, and his normal approximation were not philosophical systems, but practical breakthroughs. History tends to remember system builders more than tool makers, but science depends on both. Without De Moivre's tools, much of later mathematics would lack its foundation. Isaac Newton towered over De Moivre's generation. His laws of motion and gravitation changed physics forever. He commanded institutions, politics, and public imagination. De Moivre, though respected by Newton, never rivaled his fame. Yet Newton's work depended on interpreters like De Moivre to spread and explain it. If Newton was the architect of a new scientific universe, De Moivre was one of its essential builders and guides. Their relationship was marked by respect. Newton is reported to have told puzzled readers of the Principia, "Go to De Moivre. He knows all this better than I do." Whether apocryphal or not, the remark captured their dynamic. Newton the discoverer, De Moivre the clarifier. One reason De Moivre remained less celebrated was his status as a foreigner and refugee. He had no university, no court, no patronage. In a world where nationality and religion mattered deeply, he was perpetually the Frenchman. This outsider status both limited and liberated him. He was excluded from positions of power, but free to pursue problems others neglected. Gambling, mortality, and probability seemed trivial to many academicians. To De Moivre they were profound. His outsider's eye allowed him to see order where insiders saw distraction. When measured not by fame, but by lasting impact, De Moivre belongs alongside his contemporaries. Huygens began probability, but De Moivre gave it depth. The Bernoullis formalized the law of large numbers. De Moivre revealed the normal curve. Newton reshaped physics. De Moivre ensured the mathematics of uncertainty would stand beside mechanics as a science of its own. Though denied the titles and salaries of his peers, De Moivre's insights proved just as enduring. When Abraham de Moivre died in 1754, he left behind a body of work that included the doctrine of chances, annuities upon lives, and the formula that bears his name. These contributions were foundational, shaping probability theory, actuarial science, and complex analysis. Yet within a few decades, his name faded. Unlike Newton, Leibniz, or Bernoulli, de Moivre did not become a household figure in the history of mathematics. His legacy endured in formulas, but not in fame. Why did this happen? De Moivre's status as a Huguenot exile played a role. France rejected him, and he never returned. England tolerated him, but never fully embraced him as its own. He belonged to neither nation, and thus neither celebrated him as a native genius. Newton became a symbol of English science, Bernoulli of Swiss mathematics, Leibniz of German philosophy. De Moivre remained a foreigner everywhere, remembered only in specialist circles. Unlike many contemporaries, de Moivre never held a university chair or royal appointment. He had no students who carried his name forward as disciples, no school or institution that preserved his memory. His teaching reached individuals, but not institutions. His books circulated, but without an academic base, they were not embedded in curricula. As a result, later generations learned his formulas without learning his story. History often favors system builders over tool makers. Newton built a cosmos, Leibniz built a philosophy, Bernoulli built a law, de Moivre built tools, a formula, an approximation, an annuity model. Tools shape science, but their creators are easily forgotten once the tools become standard. Students learn de Moivre's formula and the normal curve without always remembering the man who first wrote them. The overshadowing of Laplace and Gauss. Later giants further eclipsed him. Laplace generalized de Moivre's normal approximation into the full central limit theorem. Gauss applied the normal distribution to errors of observation, branding it the Gaussian curve. What de Moivre discovered first became more famous under others' names. This is not theft, but the natural fate of pioneers. Later, figures refine and popularize ideas, and history remembers them more vividly. De Moivre himself contributed to his obscurity. He was modest, reserved, and uninterested in self-promotion. He avoided politics and patronage, preferring solitude and study. While others courted fame, he carried pages of the Principia in his pocket, reading them while waiting for pupils. His humility was admirable, but in a competitive world, it meant his legacy was less loudly proclaimed. Ironically, the one story that survived widely was the legend of his death prediction. To the general public, he became the mathematician who foretold his own end, not the father of probability approximations or annuity calculations. This reduced him to a curiosity rather than a central figure, his life summed up in an anecdote rather than his true intellectual contributions. In recent decades, historians of mathematics have restored de Moivre's reputation. They recognize him as the first to articulate the normal distribution, the bridge between Newtonian mechanics and probability, a pioneer of actuarial science, a key transmitter of mathematical knowledge in England. Though not as widely known as Newton or Gauss, he is now acknowledged as one of the founding fathers of probability theory. When Abraham de Moivre died in 1754, his reputation rested mainly in specialist circles of London. His friends in the Royal Society respected him. Gamblers remembered his doctrine of chances. Actuaries used his annuity tables. But outside these groups, his fame quickly waned. By the early 19th century, his name appeared only in footnotes. Probability was being advanced by Laplace in France and Gauss in Germany. Their refinements and generalizations overshadowed the man who had first drawn the bell curve. For nearly a century, de Moivre risked becoming a ghost in mathematics present in formulas, absent in memory. The earliest attempts to preserve his memory came from friends and admirers who wrote short memoirs after his death. These included anecdotes about his modesty, his tutoring, and, of course, his prediction of death. While these sketches kept his name alive, they emphasized legend over rigorous evaluation of his mathematics. Historians of the Enlightenment later repeated these anecdotes, often portraying him as a quaint figure, talented but marginal compared to Newton and Halley. In the 19th century, probability theory grew into a major discipline. Laplace's Théorie analytique des probabilités, 1812, and Gauss's work on error theory made probability central to astronomy, physics, and statistics. As scholars traced the origins of these ideas, they rediscovered de Moivre's contributions. Mathematicians acknowledged that the normal distribution had first been described by de Moivre in 1738. His name began to reappear in serious histories of mathematics not as a mere footnote, but as a true originator. In Britain, 19th century historians sought to reclaim de Moivre as part of the national scientific tradition. Though French-born, he had spent nearly his entire career in England, contributed to the Royal Society, and worked closely with Newton and Halley. Writers emphasized his role as a Newtonian interpreter, helping spread the Principia. They also highlighted annuities upon lives as an early milestone in the British actuarial tradition. In this way, Britain adopted him as one of its own, belatedly granting him a place in the national pantheon. In the 20th century, as statistics became a global discipline, historians gave de Moivre greater recognition. His normal approximation to the binomial was acknowledged as the first explicit use of the normal distribution decades before Gauss. Specialists in actuarial science celebrated his mortality model as one of the earliest systematic approaches to life expectancy. Scholars of complex analysis highlighted the significance of de Moivre's formula in paving the way for Euler's identity. By mid-century, textbooks began crediting him more explicitly, ensuring students of probability encountered his name alongside Bernoulli, Laplace, and Gauss. Today, historians of mathematics view de Moivre not as marginal, but as foundational. His contributions are recognized across several fields: probability theory, doctrine of chances established systematic methods, normal distribution, first mathematical formulation of the bell curve, actuarial science, simplified models of mortality and annuities, complex numbers, de Moivre's formula, precursor to Euler's identity, Newtonian science, interpreter and transmitter of the Principia. Scholars now emphasize the depth of his work, showing that he was more than just a tutor or a gambling consultant. He was a pioneer of modern mathematical thinking. In recent decades, de Moivre's life has also been studied as a story of migration and exile. Historians highlight how the expulsion of Huguenots from France scattered talent across Europe. De Moivre, once a victim of persecution, is now seen as a symbol of the intellectual resilience of refugees. His life demonstrates how knowledge crosses borders, how displacement can enrich new homelands, and how brilliance can endure even without institutions or wealth. Abraham de Moivre's journey stretched from Vitry-le-François in France to the coffee houses of London, from Huguenot exile to Fellow of the Royal Society. His life was marked by displacement, poverty, and obscurity, but also by brilliance, perseverance, and discoveries that shaped mathematics forever. He never held a professorship. He never enjoyed wealth. His name faded after death, and yet the formulas he left behind still pulse at the heart of science, finance, and statistics. De Moivre's legacy rests on several pillars. De Moivre's formula, bridging complex numbers and trigonometry, paving the way for Euler's identity. Normal approximation, the first explicit expression of the bell curve, precursor to the central limit theorem. Probability theory, his doctrine of chances transformed chance into a systematic science. Actuarial science, his annuities upon lives gave governments and insurers tools to manage risk. Newtonian interpreter, his clear explanations helped spread Newton's Principia to a wider audience. Each of these alone would secure him a place in history. Together, they form a legacy that touches nearly every modern discipline. Yet his story is not only intellectual, it is human. The boy who studied Euclid in Champagne became the exile who carried Newton's pages in his pocket. The tutor who explained gambling odds to aristocrats became the scholar who revealed the mathematics of life expectancy. His modesty, his poverty, and his quiet endurance give his life a tragic dignity. He reminds us that genius does not always live in ivory towers. It can survive in rented rooms, on scraps of paper, in the margins of history. Exiled from his country, excluded from universities, overlooked by patrons, de Moivre found his true home in numbers. They never betrayed him, never exiled him, never failed him. In equations, he found stability. In formulas, he found belonging. In probability, he found meaning. Even the story of his death, whether true or myth, captures this essence. To say he calculated the day of his passing is to say that he lived so fully by mathematics that even mortality seemed subject to its laws. Today, de Moivre's name lives on in textbooks, actuarial manuals, and scientific equations. Students encounter his formula in trigonometry, his curve in statistics, his approximations in probability. They may not always know his story, but they carry forward his insights. This is his immortality, not in monuments or wealth, but in the daily language of mathematics that shapes the modern world. Every time a bell curve is drawn, every time Euler's identity is taught, every time probabilities are calculated, de Moivre is present. Perhaps his greatest lesson is not mathematical, but human. De Moivre's life shows that brilliance can flourish even in exile, that ideas can outlast poverty, and that the contributions of outsiders can shape the destiny of nations. He was a refugee who gave England and the world a science of chance. In an age when identity and belonging often dictated destiny, he proved that intellect knows no borders. Abraham de Moivre's story is one of paradox, a man poor in life but rich in legacy, a mathematician overshadowed in his time but central to ours, a refugee who found in numbers the homeland he lost in France. He did not live to see the full flowering of his ideas, yet centuries later his work remains essential. His immortality is not in statues or fame, but in the quiet persistence of formulas that continue to order our world. And so, while his body rests in London soil, his mind endures in the eternal language of mathematics. Abraham de Moivre, the quiet Huguenot exile, lives on not in stone, but in numbers.